Okay, so we've started. Hi, everybody. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to be discussing a little bit about how we debate and analyze religion. So I'll start with a brief disclaimer, which is obviously there are many different religions, and the kind of guidelines that we're giving here are very, very broad and kind of very much personally based on my experience, specifically my experience growing up in a religious household and going to and having religious education, and also living in a fairly religious country, and also kind of how then that kind of experience meshes with the sort of analysis that I tend to hear inside debates. So to put this very shortly, this is what I'm saying here is often true of religions, but there are going to be many different religions where this is simply not applicable to, and maybe even some of the religions that I'm closer to, which are Judaism and Christianity. There are also going to be certain issues which I'm not going to touch upon, and it's not just they're not important. It's just that we don't have a huge amount of time. So please, nobody be offended by anything which I might say here. And please do feel free to comment if you think that I'm missing something here. So the most important thing, I think, when coming to discuss religious belief is to be able to define what it is that religious belief is. And specifically, what it is that differentiates religious belief from other kinds of belief. So for instance, there's a motion which often gets bandied about, which is this house prefers a world without religious belief. And if you're OG and you're discussing this motion, then you might want to stop and think for a second what it is that necessarily means. Because for instance, there are lots of other kinds of different beliefs that we have, some of which might seem very much religious. So for instance, belief in rights or some kind of Dauntological principles. It's unclear what the difference is between these and religious beliefs are. The same is true of simply belief in nationalism or other kind of abstract concepts that we have. So I was OG in this motion, and very luckily I happened to have someone who's much smarter than me, who had Monica Foreman, and she came up with this particular tidbit, which is essentially saying the difference between religious belief and other kinds of belief is the difference between belief and belief. And that means that in belief, you have something that you believe in about the world. For instance, I believe that it is now raining. And if I go outside and it's not raining, then that belief can be informed and updated that it is no longer raining. This is the difference between this and belief, which is, for instance, the belief in God. And no matter what gets told to me or what kind of proof is given, I will continue to believe this irregardless. Essentially, this means that belief is something which isn't connected to anything in the physical or the metaphysical world that we reside in. It is inherently a spiritual concept, meaning that it isn't something that is then informed by practical implications. No matter what kind of mathematical proof is shown to me, I continue to believe in God. So if we compare that, for a second, to other different kinds of belief, so the belief in utilitarianism, for instance, there can be a belief in I should make the world better for other people, and I should sum up the happiness that exists there. So for instance, I can inform someone's belief of if they believe in utilitarianism that something won't make somebody happier by showing them, look, here are people who are unhappy when we implement your proposal. And then their belief can then be informed by that, and they can change it. Even more so, we can maybe say that we can point that if we're talking about utilitarianism as a whole, we can point to simply happiness as not necessarily being the thing which is most important to other people, to change them from, say, utilitarianism to a rights-based or a different other kind of based moral groundwork to work with. The same isn't necessarily true of religious belief. Then we have stuff like Dauntology. So here it's important. So there, like, for instance, the belief in, so there it's a little more complicated, because essentially Dauntology said we believe in a certain right, or we believe in a certain something is true, no matter what the consequences are. This is an absolute truth which cannot be changed. So here, what is then the difference between this and religious belief? I would say there isn't. I would say that essentially Dauntology is a form of religious belief. And it's important to note that Kant, when proving Dauntology, or if you think that he doesn't prove Dauntology, essentially says, when he gets to the point where he's trying to prove this, relies on God in order to prove that these are principles which transcend the mundane world that we exist in, which obviously sounds familiar to you guys, that it's simply, again, something beyond the mundane world into the spiritual. It is essentially a godlike belief. So essentially, to sum up everything that we've just sort of said, if I have a belief in something, there can be an empirical outlook in the world which can change the way that I believe in something. If I have an belief, and specifically a religious belief, then I believe that it is an objective truth, regardless of anything in the world that might be pointed to, which means that it is something that can't necessarily be changed. This, you might already begin to understand that this then kind of means that there is maybe less ability to compromise or change people's minds, or create other kind of compromising systems that we talk about when discussing other beliefs, when there is somebody who simply cannot be informed or changed of a certain belief that they hold. And this is the very first thing when we begin to talk about religious belief. And to go back to the motion that I was talking about, this house prefers a world without religious belief, the case that we then ran was then analyzing what it then means to have to believe in something, and why we prefer a world where people can compromise in what they believe in, why we think that it is more likely to be abused if you cannot point out that people are wrong, and all these other kind of things which stem specifically from something which we think distinguishes between religious belief and belief. So that's the very first thing that we're talking about. The second thing that I think is important to talk about when we talk about religion is to say something quite simple. Religion is not a choice. So again, we're going back to, this stems from the first point that we're talking about, but it's important to note, because a lot of the time I hear in debates when discussing people's religious rights, a lot of people, not just debaters, but people as a whole, seem to be fairly dismissive of people's ability to have the right that they believe in, and specifically point out the fact that people can simply choose not to do this. So if we're talking about a ban on hijabs, or we're talking or other kind of religious symbols in other places, it tends to, people tend to often run lines that people can simply choose not to wear a hijab, much like someone can choose not to wear a shirt or any other kind of clothing. And here is where I think it's important to note that this is simply not the same and not comparable. So if we go back to the issue of saying that someone who believes in their religion his mind can't necessarily be changed, and it's important to note here what they believe in. So specifically, when someone believes in a religious practice, such as the wearing of a hijab, the wearing of a kippah, the wearing of a cross, or any other kind of religious practice, they think this is the word of God, right? They believe this is the word of God. They believe that this is the word of God. This is something that is necessarily true and necessarily right. To not do this is therefore something which is horrendous and horrible to them, much in the same way that we might think that killing someone, not to put it very, very strongly, would be a terrible thing to do. Because as far as they are concerned, religiously and morally and imperatively, they have to do this certain thing. And to force them to do otherwise is not giving them a choice to do so. So notice, for instance, that this then informs all kind of analysis that we tend to have on people's religion. For instance, or banning religion in public places, or for instance, there was a motion in the Euros a while ago about bombing religious sites, and whether this would be something that we would permit people to do. And the case run there claimed, in the same way that we do not allow people to poison wells or scorch farmland or deny food and water to people in a time of need, we cannot allow people in their time of need not have access to religious sites and to religion. Because for these people, their religious beliefs are more important than life itself. And again, from almost every single religious outlook, there is a belief in something beyond the world, beyond the mundane, which is more important than what happens here inside a practical world. And again, if we look at this historically and we can think about this, there have been people who have been willing to die for their beliefs time and time again. This was true in the Crusades of the Muslim population, who were willing to die rather than convert to Christianity. This was true during the times of the Inquisition during Spain, and this was also true in China with Christian communities under pressure there. Time and time again, people have proven that they are willing to die rather than give up on what they believe inside their religion. Now, all of this means that we should then take quite a fair bit more seriously people's religious choices and people's religious belief than otherwise said. Having said all that, I'm now going to contradict it completely. Because the third thing that I want to talk about when discussing religion is that religion is permutable, as in religion does change. So for people inside a religion, there is often, again, as I said, the idea that the religion that they have and the practices that they're doing is the word of God and is something that has been handed to them and is the objective truth and cannot be argued with. So up until now, I've been talking from inside a religious belief. Now I'm going to step outside of my household and go in and into the world that I currently live in, which is a more secular belief, and say that the religion that we practice, all religions that we practice today have obviously changed over time and changed immensely. The religion that we practice today is obviously incredibly different to the religion that was the religion that was practiced 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, right? So Judaism has changed completely, Christianity has changed completely, Islam has changed completely, Hinduism has changed completely, Buddhism has changed completely. So this means that religion can change, and this means that also probably isn't necessarily the objective truth. The question is, though, if people currently today believe that what they are practicing is the objective truth, then they wouldn't necessarily be able to compromise. It doesn't necessarily matter. Again, you can point out to them that their religion has changed, and this is probably not the word of God, because if it was the word of God, then we would be practicing religion the same way it was practiced 2,000 years ago. But it isn't necessarily convincing to them, because again, this is a question of belief versus belief. But when analyzing religion in debates, we can discuss how it is that we can inform and change religion. So there are two main ways historically that religions have been changed. So one is the way that they are affected by the practical. So by the practical, I mean that in the way that technology has changed, that states have changed, that all kinds of like physical implementations have changed, means that religions have changed as well. So for instance, Judaism used to be most of its rules used to have to do with farming, because all of the things that they would do were to farm. Now that Jews are no longer mostly farmers, there are many, many different rules and accords which have to do with trading, with bartering, with running businesses, and with doing all kinds of other things which simply didn't exist at the time when farming was the main thing that Jews did. This means that when we change laws and the world changes as well, then religious belief and religious ability can change. It's also important to note that most religions have changed with the regimes that they existed. So for instance, when we look at the Vatican and we look at the Pope used to be accepted that the Pope was beyond any kind of law, and the papal state was beyond the monarchs and the kings of Europe and could make any kind of decree and had its own courts and its own system, and it would be unthinkable that you could try somebody that the Pope wanted to try inside a regular judicial court. Then at the end of the Middle Ages, the kings in Europe got together and decided that they would quite like to try people in their own courts, thank you very much, and took away this power from the papal state. Notice that there had been accords and religious beliefs which proved that it was necessarily impossible for someone that the Pope wanted to put in trial to be tried anywhere else. 100, 200 years after the fact, after this had changed, these accords were no longer in effect, had been changed, subsequent popes had changed them and slowly eased them out. And the same is true of other major religions interacting with political states as well. The fact is that religions, though they might claim to be spiritual and unconnected to the mundane world, are quite obviously interacting with the mundane world with practical effects on a day-to-day basis. And so when we want to discuss changing religious belief and changing minds, it's often important to remember that we can change this by changing laws and changing rules as well. We have to then show why it is probable that the religions will change in accordance, and we'll get to that later. Before that, the other thing I want to discuss is the other kind of ways that religions change, and that is simply from being influenced by other kind of ideologies and other kind of belief sets as well. So obviously, religions beget religions. This we know. So Christianity is a certain kind of was sprung up from Judaism, as Islam also was heavily influenced by both of these religious sects, and other religions as well have also been influenced by other religions and gone their way. But the other thing that they're also influenced by is other kind of ideological beliefs as well. So for instance, like the Greek philosophy of Aristotle and Plato has had a huge effect on all of the major religions, and they've incorporated certain beliefs from these canonical texts into their religious systems and into commandments as well, and into religious commandments as well. And the same is true of ideas, for instance, of nationalism. So nationalism is something which is slightly foreign to religions, because it says that it says that people are not. So, for instance, if you're a religion such as Christianity, which claims a global sphere and a global sphere of influence, so nationalism is something which is kind of goes against that sort of belief, because it necessarily separates us into different groups. But for instance, there have been many different meldings of nationalism to Christianity. In Spain and in Italy and in other countries as well, nationalism and religion have been influenced by one another. And there's also been decrees made that, for instance, that the word of the king or the word of the ruler is holy because they are there by divine right. The Romans too, which Jeff Sessions so recently used to try and justify taking away immigrant children at the border. All of these kind of religious commandments say that we can then use different ideological beliefs and marry them into our religious system. What then is the way that this happens? And when is it likely that either a practical implementation, such as a change of law or a change of technology, or an ideological implementation, such as a new ideology spring up, is likely to affect religions and likely to have an effect on it? So the first thing is to note that there is more choice inside religions for the leaders of that religion and the spiritual leaders of those religions, rather than the mass followers. So again, we're going back to a debate that we might have about banning religious symbols inside public areas. It might be made, a point might be made that for the vast majority of people inside this religion, there is no choice. They believe that they must wear this religious symbol, and you are taking away their right to do so. It's important to note that in most religions, however, there are people, spiritual leaders, who have a closer connection to the text and a closer connection and ability to therefore interpret and change the text as need be. So one of the things that needs to be, one of the lines that often gets made is a realpolitik kind of line. It is it in the interests of the leaders of this religion who have the ability to change the text to incorporate the change that we want to make? So is it in the interest of the religious leaders in France, for instance, to allow, specifically of the Muslim community, to allow a ban on hajj? Probably not. But that is somewhere that we would want to start analyzing to prove that this is something that maybe in the long term can change over time. The other thing that is important to look to is, are there places inside the spiritual text that can be interpreted to incorporate these different religious beliefs and these different religious ideas? So thanks to the sprawling nature of the religious texts and the fact that they are so large, it's often very easy to find different sets of passages which can be used to justify different bits, different laws in the future. And again, this is what rabbis and imams and priests too every single day when they're reinterpreting the text. So it's important to note, is there somewhere that we can base this kind of change that we want to make religion on in the text? Even better, if you can, is to, if you know the religion particularly well, is to look for a certain sect or a group or a certain mainstream interpretation of this text, which already incorporates elements of the change that we want to make inside the religion. Because then obviously it is more likely that this change can happen if there is already been changes made like this in the past to that religion. It points to the plausibility of this happening again. And again, note that this is something which leaders can make a change to, which the day-to-day followers often can't. So the other thing to note here, when we talk about how the religions change, is to analyze what this religion is. So up until this point, I've been talking about religions in a slightly homogeneous concept, as in, so when I talk about Judaism, I'm talking about all of Judaism, Christianity, all of Christianity. That's obviously not true. Like, there are different groups inside religions and different sects inside those religions as well. And obviously there are different numbers of people inside each one of those sects, and there is a different strength of belief and a change belief inside these different sects. So for instance, I'm going to just go with Judaism because it's what's easiest and most approachable to me. So inside Judaism, roughly, that you have the ultra-Orthodox, who are the also known as the black hats, who are the most stringently religious people and have the most stringent rules. Then you have what we call the national religious group of people, who are religious and who necessarily have and necessarily do follow rules, but not as stringently as the ultra-Orthodox and are more open to interpretation. Then you have a group of people who we call traditional, who observe certain rules, things which have to do with family and home, and see the religion as something which brings their family and home together. And then, for instance, you have people who are completely secular. This is even without going into the fact that you have Reformed and Conservative and many other different groups as well. So if I were to analyze religion in Israel and trying to make a change in Israel, I would be talking about these different groups, and I would be talking about which of these groups are most likely to change. So again, let's take a motion here. Let's take a motion about separating church and state in Israel. So there are groups. So when we talk about the ultra-Orthodox, who are the most stringently opposed to any kind of changes to their religion, it is most likely that they are the people who are not going to change their minds, and would therefore probably not be people that we could change inside this debate. Then we talk about the national religious, people who are more open to interpretation, and there we would want to specifically analyze who the leaders of these religions are, why they are likely to be close to the state, why they are likely to gain specifically from this separation, why it means that they will expand maybe their power over the people inside their religion because they no longer have to parley with the state about making religious decrees, because they can simply make the decrees themselves. And then we can talk about the traditional, who we can say are probably not going to be affected by this very much either way, because the kind of traditions that they want to upkeep regarding family and home are things which are likely to remain even with a separation of church and state. And then we can point to we can say this is therefore something likely to gain support if we can specifically change the minds of the national religious parties and their leaders. So that's sort of the example of what we would want to do when discussing how we can change religion and change religious minds as well, even if we think that this is something which for the majority of people involved in it, their minds can't be changed overnight and can't be changed based on negotiation or facts. I'm going to have a look now to see if there are any questions regarding what I've just said before continuing. Okay, so we appear to be good. So I'm going to now sum up the stuff that I've talked about so far. So we began with the idea that we simply cannot, that the thing that which differentiates between religious belief and other kinds of belief is the idea that this is something that can't be changed based on mundane practices or based on some kind of ability to show people that they are wrong and inform them of their opinion. We then moved on from there to discuss how the idea then means that for the majority of people inside religion, religion is simply not a choice for them. It means that they believe that what they are doing is mandatory. And to take away this right is something that we need to weigh very heavily when we decide to do so. And then the final thing that we discussed is the idea that, having said all of this, it is possible to change religion over time. And obviously, factually, this is true because religions have changed. And therefore, we need to discuss what are the different ways that we can change religion, how the ways that practical differences can inform religions and change them, and also the way that ideological differences can inform them and change it, and how by looking into the different subsets of the religion and breaking it down from some homogeneous group into the different strands of religions that which exist inside it, and also the difference between leaders inside that religion who have access to text and access to the ability to make changes and access to politicians most of the time versus the basic believer, and weigh up the differences there. That's all from me for now. So thank you very much for your time, and hopefully see you again soon. Bye.